Welcome to the ADDIE podcast, the show for teachers ready to step outside the classroom and into their next chapter. I'm your host, Charity Bosch, and I know firsthand how overwhelming it can feel to leave teaching behind. Whether you're exploring instructional design, navigating corporate culture, or just figuring out your first steps, this show is your roadmap. Each episode will tackle the real challenges, share practical strategies, and prove that your teaching skills are exactly what the world needs, just in a different setting. Let's turn that classroom expertise into your career advantage. Today we are going to talk about understanding instructional design models. So first, let's talk about why models even matter. Models matter in instructional design because they help provide structure for the design process. It gives you something to follow instead of just being all over the place. It also helps you be able to communicate with your stakeholders. Stakeholders also understand processes very well, and it gives you something to be able to tell them the progress, how far along we are, how much we have left, what the next steps are, things like that. One thing to keep in mind, regardless of what model you are working with, and oftentimes, at least I know for me personally, you're not really working with one specific model. It's kind of amalgamation of many models, but they are not rigid rules. They are helpful frameworks. In fact, I often will not use the term model and I will use framework, the ADDIE framework instead of the ADDIE model, because it just automatically lends to a little bit more flexibility than people are used to when you're following a model exactly. Again, most companies use some variation. I use some variation. I kind of take components of one and another, and that's kind of what has made up my process. And even within my process, I allow for flexibility. I ensure there's a lot of iteration so that there's a lot of give and take. It's not, well, we're done with this step and we're on to the next. A lot of times people will look at these models as like a waterfall, and that's not exactly the case. Once you're done with the A in ADDIE, for example, and you move on to the D, it's not like you can't go back to the A, but a lot of people will look at it that way. So, talking about ADDIE, let's launch into that. The ADDIE model, or framework as I like to call it, is the most common and traditional approach when it comes to instructional design. And the ADDIE in ADDIE stands for Analyze, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. It is a linear model framework, but you can build in iteration. And so a lot of times people will look at ADDIE as a waterfall method, where once you're done with the A, you move to the first D. Once you're done with design, you move on to development, and you go through until you're done, and then that's it. But you can build in iteration, and that is something that I do a lot. The ADDIE model is a great starting point for beginners, especially because it is kind of been around the longest. It's the most common and traditional approach. And so it's a great place to start. It gives a good foundation of understanding what encompasses instructional design. And so it's a great place to review and look at there. It works best almost in any environment. However, my asterisk here is that it is not typically very iterative. It's usually very linear, very waterfall. And so it can be used in any context. It's best if you build in iteration though. So you're going to use ADDIE, but you're going to amend it a little bit to do more prototyping and things that some of these other models are just more built into them than ADDIE has. The next model I want to talk about is SAM. SAM is the Successive Approximation Model. SAM is inherently more iterative than ADDIE. It is a rapid prototyping approach, and it connects a lot well with the Agile method, which we'll get into, but I use components of SAM, particularly the rapid prototyping approach. So when I am building a course, whether it's e-learning or instructor-led, virtual or in person, or any sort of hybrid approach, I rapidly prototype what it's going to look like. This is not pretty. We call them MVPs, minimum viable product. So I'm looking for the thing that will get the job done, but it doesn't look great. And that gives us a springboard to then have reviews from before you get too into the weeds and spend too much time on formatting, because if the content changes, the formatting is going to change. And that's where SAM comes in really helpful with that rapid prototyping, because you can start really simple get it out there, have your SMEs and stakeholders focus just on the content before you invest the time and resources into the formatting side. There are typically 3 phases with continuous refinement in SAM. SAM is better for projects that have tight timelines, although there's a lot of overlap you'll see with many of these models with ADDIE because, again, it was kind of the first one. It's that common traditional method that has been used for a very long time. SAM is also really helpful when your stakeholders want to see the progress quickly, and that's where that rapid prototyping comes in. You could quickly whip something up and say, hey, this isn't finalized. This is just a prototype. There's the first one especially, it's not going to look pretty, but it's at least going to start painting the picture in their mind and helping you illustrate what the end result is going to look like. And so when you have stakeholders that want to see things often, SAM comes in really handy because you can give them those little tidbits to kind of satiate their desire as you work through the project. The next one I want to talk to you about is the constructivist approach. I like the constructivist approach, and if you're following along, you're going to start seeing that I borrow elements from pretty much all of the models. And the main element that I borrow from the constructivist approach is it is a learner-centered design. So for me, any project that I'm working on, the stakeholders don't matter, the SME doesn't matter. Those are just resources that I need to use or people that I am held accountable to. But who matters to me the most is always the learner. At the end of the day, they're going to be the ones going through the course. They are the ones that matter the most. And so I borrow from the constructivist approach because I always make sure that my designs are learner-centered designs. You are building knowledge through experience. And that's really important to me because I want to make sure that it's not just like I'm throwing a bunch of facts at you, giving you a couple multiple choice questions and calling it a course. That's not how I work. I don't build checkbox training. And to me, those are key elements of checkbox training. Instead, I like to build in a lot of scenarios, a lot of real world application. If you're going through a sales training, you are going to be put into situations that you would commonly see, and you get a safe place to practice those. And so that's also part of that constructivist approach, is using those experience to build the knowledge rather than memorization or those lower level cognitive tasks. It also has a very large social learning emphasis. And so that's where you'll see like discussion boards within courses where the learners within the course can go and interact together. Things like that are also really stemming from that constructivist approach. We look at them a lot from a gamification perspective, but at the end of the day, it's that social learning coming from this approach that has kind of influenced those things. It is less structured than the other models, which I don't like. It is a little bit more kind of feely, if you want to call it that. But it's also really good for complex skill development, especially because, again, you're going to be focusing on the learner. You're going to be focused on building knowledge through experience and encompassing those social components. So when you have a lot of customer service training, sales training, things like that, the constructivist approach is really good for to help build some of those more complex skills that your learners are going to need. The next one I want to discuss is one of my favorites. It is Agile for instructional designers. And Megan Torrance is kind of the queen of this, and she has a book on it that I highly recommend. But this approach is borrowed from software development. So in software development, you can think of apps, computer software, things like that. They use an agile approach, and this approach is sprint-based. And so you have sprints within the project, and in each sprint, there are certain things that need to get done. And so in sprint 1, we'll say these are our 3 goals that need to get done in this sprint. Sprints are really short. Usually they're like 1 to 2 weeks. And so this borrows some of these elements from software development, but applies them in instructional design. So you will have shorter phases within your project where you're trying to get things done. And typically in a sprint, you're not finishing a whole course. I don't want you to think, oh gosh, in a sprint, I'm going to have to finish a whole course. That's not how it is. Maybe sprint 1, you're working on the design plan and the storyboard only. And those are the 2 main things that you're trying to get done in those couple weeks. And then in the next sprint, you might jump around and you're working on the assessment. And so it's really nice because it doesn't have to be a linear approach. And I mean that not just in the process, but also the course. Sometimes you'll have multiple people working on a course in an agile environment. And so someone might be working on the first lesson while someone else is working on the 3rd lesson at the same time. And so it just allows for a lot more adaptability. You have a lot more frequent stakeholder feedback. And so kind of going in line with Sam, where you have that rapid prototyping, you'll see that a lot in Agile as well, because the two are very closely related. And it's very highly collaborative. You might have 3 different people working on one course together. And so you're having to collaborate so that there's cohesion throughout the course and it flows naturally and the tone of voice matches and all of those things. And so it is a very highly collaborative model, which is also something that I really like. It works really well in fast-paced environments. So if you think about software development, things are moving quickly. Things can change at the drop of a hat. And Agile for instructional design, it's kind of the same thing. If you're moving really quickly, you have tight deadlines. This one also works really well. And it helps when you have change. And that's one of my favorite things from Megan Torrance from that book. One of the things I highlighted very early on in the book was like, embrace change. Change is always going to happen. It's the one constant. The sooner you are able to embrace it and build it into your process instead of viewing it as a roadblock, the easier your life is going to become. And I have really, truly seen that in my experience. Somebody comes to me and says, oh, we want to change this thing now. It needs to go this direction. Early on in my career, I would get frustrated. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, that totally ruins everything that I've worked on so far. We're completely changing directions. And I viewed it as a roadblock and an obstacle. But once I started viewing it and just embracing it, of saying like, okay, you guys are the stakeholders. Let's talk through it and make sure this is the change we really want to make. And then if, this is the change we need to make, then it's like, okay. And I say it all the time. I've told my employees, I've told contractors that I've worked with, it's okay. I don't want you to think all of your work is wasted because you got paid for it. And now you're going to get paid for the change. So at the end of the day, you're still getting paid either way. You're just switching gears now. And it's good to have a really adaptable, flexible perspective, especially if you're working in an agile environment. The last one I want to talk about is design thinking for learning. And I also borrow some elements from this model. Again, you can kind of start seeing that like I pick and choose what speaks to me the most and that I found to work in my experience the most from the different models. I don't follow one exactly. And I certainly don't follow just one. It's, again, a combination of bits and pieces from all of them. But in design thinking for learning, it, much like the constructivist approach, is very human-centered. And so, again, going back to that learner, they're the end-all be-all, they're who matter most. Design thinking for learning deploys a human-centered problem-solving approach. And there's kind of some key phases. If you think about ADDIE, the acronym matches. There's no acronym to match this, but there's also phases within design thinking for learning. So you start with empathizing, which is something that I like to do as well as I build out my learner personas and have a learner-centric approach, human-centered problem-solving approach. You empathize with your learners. So you put yourselves in their shoes, trying to think of where they're coming from, what they're bringing in already. Sometimes it's nothing at all. Really spend the time to get to know who your learners are going to be, because if you know who your learners are going to be, you know what they like, what they dislike, what their experience is, what their background is, all of those things, then it's a lot easier to build a course that is suited for them. And that is something that I employ in my process, are building learner personas for the audience or sometimes audiences that a course is going to end up with. And then from there, you define the project scope, the outcomes, those sorts of things. You can kind of think of the define phase as in ADDIE, that analysis phase, when you're taking a look at the needs analysis, what needs to happen, what are our outcomes, that sort of things. And then from the defining, you go to an ideate. So you spend a little bit more time thinking through things instead of just diving into the development straight away. You can think of the ideate almost like the design phase in ADDIE. And then you get into prototyping and testing. And this is where it gets a little bit more cyclical rather than ADDIE being more linear. You are prototyping, you're testing, you're refining, building a new prototype, testing, refining, building it however many times you need to get to the end results that's going to give you what you're looking for accomplishing within that course. I like design thinking for learning because it's a very creative and innovative strategy. So you are able to test a lot more. You're able to maybe in your beta testing, you can go through and say, oh, okay, I have kind of 2 ideas in mind. I want to see which one's going to perform best. And you can do kind of like split testing, A/B testing, you might have heard it called. People will do this like with email sometimes. They'll send the same email but to one set of people, they'll send it with a certain subject line, and to another set of people, they'll send it with a different subject line, and they'll see which subject line gets people to open, right? So it's kind of that same idea of like, okay, let's test maybe two different approaches if we have that in mind, and you can be a lot more creative and innovative with the solutions that you come up with. This is a great model for complex organizational challenges. So I use this model a little bit more heavily as far as following it more exactly. If I'm working with a company on something regarding change management within their company, they're going to completely switch up a process. They are encountering this really complex challenge that you're trying to identify solutions for. This is where I'll kind of pull this one out more heavily and rely on the process a little bit more as it is, because it's going to really help because you're prototyping and testing so often. It emphasizes the user experience, which is something that I borrow regardless of what I'm working on, is how the learner goes through the course and the experience they are encountering as they do that is really important. And this comes back to that human-centered problem-solving approach and the learner-centered design. Those things really work hand in hand in emphasizing that user experience and really focusing on making sure that people aren't getting frustrated by the experience going through the course, that they can be successful and they're not getting hung up on, technical challenges if it's e-learning or not having the right access and support from the instructor in an instructor-led course. So you're really focused on, again, the end person that the course is being built for. Your stakeholders matter, your SMEs matter, they are important. But for me, always, the learner is the most important person as I'm building a course, because at the end of the day, it's for them. So how do you choose the right model? Again, I don't rely on just one model or a specific model as I'm building a course and follow it exactly how it is. I take bits and pieces of the different models and apply what makes sense and what I've found to work best. However, if you're just starting out, that might be a little bit more tricky because you don't have that experience to be able to decide that. So a couple things to think through as you're trying to choose which model you want to follow as you're working on a project are timeline considerations. If you have a tight timeline, again, that Agile, the SAM, those are going to work really well when you have a really tight deadline and you need to deploy kind of more of a rapid approach. ADDIE and design thinking for learning are great when you have a little bit more time and you're not as rushed, and especially design thinking for learning, you have the time to prototype test, however long it might take, or, sometimes you can iterate forever. That will be my asterisk here. You can iterate forever. You can prototype and test until you're blue in the face, and you still might not be completely satisfied. At some point, it needs to end. At some point, it's good enough, not perfect. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. However, when you do have a little bit more time to spend on those iterations, design thinking for learning, ADDIE, the constructivist approach, those are all good models for those situations. Another thing to think through is stakeholder preference. I have right now a client who are my stakeholders that is very hands-off. They're like, you're the expert. We don't need to review the design plan. We don't need to review the content outline. We don't need to review every single step. We just want to review it when you think it's good and in a good place. So my stakeholder prefers to be more hands-off and to not have as many checkpoints in. And so I'm not going to use a full SAM or Agile approach in that moment because it's not necessary and it's not what my stakeholder wants. However, I have another client right now that wants frequent check-ins, that wants to know what I'm up to every single week. I send all of my clients a Friday update email, kind of, this is what I got done, this is what's up next, here's the timeline update, things like that. I do that regardless, but this client in particular really wants more frequent touch points, wants to see things more often, does a lot more reviewing than that other client. And so I use more of an Agile approach with this client. I use a little bit more of the SAM. And so that's where I pull those pieces in more heavily, even if I'm still using elements of the other models. I'm just relying more heavily on some of those components from those models that are going to help me give my stakeholder what they're wanting and looking for. Another thing to consider is the organizational culture fit. So some organizations have great cultures for Agile and SAM. If you're working with a software company, they're going to know that. It's going to be familiar with them. It's going to be part of their culture already. And so you're going to pull those ones out a little bit more because that's what they're used to. If you have a more traditional organization that likes to do things maybe a little bit slower, they have a lot more checks and balances, things within their process already, things like ADDIE are going to be more familiar to them because ADDIE is a more traditional approach. And so you can take a look at whether it's a culture of a company that you are working for as a full-time employee or the organization culture of a client that you are doing. If you're doing freelancing, you can take a look at what their culture is and kind of make it match with what they're going to be used to seeing. Content complexity is also another thing to consider. If you have really complex content, things like design thinking for learning and the constructivist approach are going to be something you'll rely more heavily on because they are built with more complex things in mind. Agile and SAM is good for less complex things, and I'm not saying you can't use them for complex. I use pieces of them for complex things, but there are models that lend better to more complex content and models that lend to simpler content. And then you also want to think about your available resources. When we talk about Agile, sometimes you have 3 people working on one course at the same time. And if you don't have 3 people, you don't have the resources available to adopt an Agile approach, which is fine. Again, you can use bits and pieces once you get the experience with using the different models and using them within different organizations and cultures. You can adapt based on who you have available. If I have a tight deadline, it's a simpler content, and I am able to bring in some contractors, I will use Agile. They will be working on bits and pieces of the same course at the same time. That works. Sometimes I don't have that available to me, and so I'm not going to rely on that sort of a process if I don't have those resources available. At the end of the day, I don't want you to get overwhelmed. Start with one model, learn it really well, and then adapt as you gain the experience. Again, for me, starting out right off the bat, ADDIE was what I used heavily because it is the most common and traditional approach. It is what I had learned the most in my master's, probably the only thing that was great that I got out of my master's program, but I relied on it very heavily. And then as I gained experience and learned more about the other models, I started adapting my process. And like I've said, most projects are going to end up blending approaches. You are going to pick elements of the different models that work for the project and kind of combine them all. So I can confidently say when I'm working on a project, it is not 100% ADDIE. It is not 100% SAM. It is not 100% constructivist. You get the point. It's never 100% one model. I will be using bits and pieces from the different models. So you're going to blend those approaches and focus on the principles, not perfection. It is very rare that a project we'll keep with ADDIE because it's the most common, will follow ADDIE exactly and it will work perfectly. The ideas behind the different phases or the different components of the model are what matter more than following it perfectly. Each model kind of has its own emphasis, its own purpose, its own ideal situation, but it's very rare to run into those ideal situations exactly in real life. So focus on the underlying principles of the models rather than trying to follow them perfectly. Now, you as a teacher already use a lot of elements of these models. You just might not have realized it or know what to call it. Lesson planning is a great example of you doing these models. As you are lesson planning, you are incorporating elements of these. You are having to analyze, where are my students at now with this topic? Where do I need to get them to be? That's the A in ADDIE. You're empathizing with your learners. You have some struggling learners. You have some learners that are above the curve and need to have different adaptations. You are doing a lot of these things. You just probably haven't realized it or known what to call it. Your classroom experience comes in so wonderfully when it gets to instructional design and using these models because it's something that you have been doing for so long. And it's really seamless transition from teaching into these components of instructional design. You're just learning what they're called and you're learning what the different models are and what the different underlying principles of the models are. So I don't want you to feel like, oh gosh, this is completely brand new territory. I know nothing about this. That's not the case. You just might not have known that it's what you've been doing all along. Please make sure that you subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. Share this with your teacher friends who are considering a change, and connect with me on Instagram at the ADDIE Den. The models are tools, not rules. Your teaching instincts are going to kick in and will help guide making good choices. Practice with one approach first and then expand and learn. Again, I would recommend starting with ADDIE. It's the most common and traditional, and it's going to relate to your teaching experience very well. And then from there, you can start expanding and experimenting with those other models.